Today I speak with Mr. Jihad Azour, who is the Director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department at the International Monetary Fund, where he oversees the fund's work in the Middle East and North Africa region, as well as Central Asia and the Caucasus. It's important to better understand how the Israel-Hamas war and the conflict in the Middle East at large is impacting regional economies, particularly surrounding the conflict, as well as the GCC from the fund's perspective. So thank you so much, Mr. Azour, for joining us today. And my first question is, what is your assessment at this time, at this point, more than 140 days into the conflict, of the impact of the war on economies in the region?
First of all, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with you again. You are asking a very challenging questions because things are moving as we speak. And also, we have to understand that uncertainty is extremely high and the risk of escalation and the deepening of the conflict are still there. However, with what we know, I think we could assess the impact in three dimensions. Impact on the epicenter and neighboring countries, i.e. Palestine and the neighboring countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, and also the broader impact and what are the main channels of that impact. Of course, the impact on the epicenter is immense in terms of destruction of infrastructure, in addition to all the suffering that people are going through, which has led to a massive decline in economic activities, both in West Bank as well as also in Gaza, with a difference. We had to revise downward our projections for 2023 by 9% decline. And now we project that the economy in 2023 will shrink by 6%. Of course, as the conflict continues, the impact is growing. The impact is not only on economic activity and infrastructure, but also on the ability of investment to happen on the private sector to operate, both in terms of the work of the authorities in Gaza, as well as also in West Bank. Public finance also has been affected with the drop in revenues and the decline in transfers of revenues from Israel to the Palestinian Authority. Coming to the neighboring countries, the countries who are directly affected were mainly Lebanon, because we had a massive displacement of population, more than 100,000 people, in addition to the destruction of houses, agricultural activities, and some infrastructure. The second dimension was the drop in tourism, and therefore we expect that this will have an important impact on the last quarter of last year and the first quarter of this year. Jordan, Egypt, the main impact was on their economic activities, tourism for both countries. And we expect that growth will drop by 0.6% in the case of Egypt and 0.4% in the case of Jordan. Egypt has an additional issue, which is trade, with the drop in trade and all the traffic going through the Suez Canal. This has an impact on the Egyptian economy. As you know, per month, the revenues from Suez Canal are around $700 million. Now, with traffic declined by more than 56% year to year, we expect this to have a large impact on revenues from Suez Canal, in addition to the impact on tourism as well as also on trade. Beyond that, there are three main dimensions that we look at. One, impact on real activity, on economic activity, impact on oil and gas, and impact on the financial sector. Oil and gas, we had in the first 2 weeks some volatility, but markets regained normalcy after that. Supply and demand are now driving both the price and the demand in the market. And even the extension of the OPEC Plus agreement did not have a big impact on prices. Therefore, a limited impact on the oil and gas market, both in terms of prices as well as also in terms of flow and supply. When it comes to financial sector, or financial issues, we saw in the beginning some outflow and widening of the spreads, and then things also regained some normalcy. And now we see countries in the region regaining access to international financial markets. In terms of broader economic activities, there are two important dimensions in addition to tourism. One is trade, of course, and especially for countries who are part of the global supply chain. And the second is investment sentiment, especially in terms of FDIs as well as also private sector investment. So, therefore, those are the, I would say, the main issues that we could highlight as of today. Of course, the two important dimensions to highlight here, that uncertainties are extremely high and still casting a shadow on the outlook for this year, and risks are on the downside. And there are a large number of issues that could become or could materialize in terms of risks on the region.
So when it comes to the GCC in particular, I mean, of course, as you described, there's different type of impact on neighboring countries to the conflict, but also these economies, particularly with the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt, have had their fair share of economic challenges at varying levels. But with the GCC, this conflict started, or the war started after the Hamas attack on October 7th, with relatively, good projections for some of the GCC economies. So are they more shielded because we haven't seen such fluctuations in the oil and gas markets globally?
Indeed, the GCC economies in particular had, in the last few years, strong recovery post-COVID. And this was mainly driven by the activity in the non-oil sector, where we saw levels of growth exceeding 4 to 4.5%, which is relatively high compared to global growth trends in the last few years. This has helped them to maintain a fairly good level of growth despite the extension of the OPEC Plus agreement, which has an impact on their oil sector. We project that this year, their economy will also have the same pattern. The growth will be mainly driven by the non-oil sector. The extension of the OPEC Plus agreement will have an impact on the overall growth because of its impact on the oil sector. The two main dimensions that led us to downward our growth projections for 2024 were the oil drop in export and the impact of the geopolitical tensions and the events that are happening. Therefore, for the GCC, what one could say is, A, the effort of diversification has started to bear fruits, especially on the structural reform side. Two, their ability to maintain a good level of activity during COVID and post-COVID is paying off. The impact of the oil sector is on their, I would say, external account, balance of payment on their financial account, though less than before because of the diversification of government revenues. And their effort to accelerate their economic transformation, investing in climate and technology in new sectors, are, I would say, providing them with an additional ambition for the next 5 to 10 years. The situation is not the same for all oil exporting countries, though, and here we have country-specific issues to take into consideration.
So moving away from the GCC, and perhaps because you have varying economies with varying challenges, what can some of the immediate neighbors to the conflict currently, what can some of these governments do to, or what policies can they present to try to mitigate the risk as much as they can, or minimize the impact or the shocks to their economies?
It's a very important question. In fact, there are 3 levels of actions. One is to shield the economy from the shock. 2, to strengthen resilience. Three is to still engage into transformative recovery. Shielding the economy from the shock requires to increase buffers to make sure that the capacity of the government is there in order to address any short-term immediate issues, increase the capacity for the government to intervene. This is something that is important for countries like Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria. But of course, the Syrian economy is not, I would say, in a very good shape. The second dimension is resilience, because this shock comes over and above certain number of challenges. We have the long-standing issues of low growth, high unemployment, especially at the youth level, low participation of women in the economy, that were compounded with the COVID shock, and countries were almost, recovering some of the lost ground since COVID, and then this new shock hit them. Therefore, strengthening the resilience, especially for countries with high level of debt, is very important. How this can be achieved? By having tight monetary and fiscal policy, because inflation is still high, although it's declining. And this was one of the, I would say, good news last year. Yet, it's very important to maintain the trend of consolidation. I think what is even now more important is to do it in an inclusive way, i.e. to increase equity in the way you do these things, give more predictability in the way you manage the medium term, and also use this moment to address some of the challenges in terms of rebuilding your fiscal and monetary buffers. Three is structural reforms. I think the economy in several countries in the region requires still certain important reforms. Those reforms are needed because you need to have more jobs. We need around 100 million new jobs in the region in the next 10 years. And this would come if you do the right reforms, if you allow the private sector to grow, which means that you have to resize the role of the state and the dimension of the state. You have to improve and strengthen the access to finance, which means that the financing of the state should not burden what the private sector need in terms of capital. Three, you need to improve your business environment, both in terms of infrastructure, doing business predictability in your laws. Those are important issues. In addition to two new dimensions that are becoming more important, climate is an issue. And it has proved in the last year that climate challenges or even catastrophes could have a big impact. Libya, Syria, Morocco, three climate events that had an impact, especially on rurality and low-income people. Therefore, climate is an important dimension. And the industries of the future, technology, AI. We saw recently that one of the main drivers in the Gaza economy was technology. And the role of technology in expanding the capacity of growth, of connectivity, is also becoming very important. The last dimension in that is, should we change the way we look at regional coordination? And my answer is definitely yes. And I think this would provide new opportunities. And this is something that also will help increase stability in the region.
So and thank you for mentioning regional coordination. That was going to be my next question, because in various economic assessments, the MENA region continues to be one of the least economically integrated regions in the world, even though it has a lot going for it in terms of, even if we just single out the common language, which facilitates trade, all sorts of exchanges, etc. Of course, you mentioned various uncertainties in the path ahead, but how can the region become more integrated post-conflict? And perhaps this is a bit of a projection, but what are the main ingredients in that recipe for strengthening regional integration economically?
Well, first, we need to understand how the world is changing, because coordination is for a purpose, to increase the common public good, increase the capacity to grow the markets, and so on. The world is changing rapidly. We have fragmentation that is now affecting the way globalization is shaping up. We have a redefinition of regional or cross-regional cooperation. We saw recently, for example, a greater interest in growing relationships with China, with Africa, with even Central Asia, and so on. We saw some of the countries joining the BRICS. Therefore, we have to understand how the world is changing. And the world is changing and changing rapidly. And what could be maybe a challenge for other parts of the world can become an opportunity. Countries have already benefited from that. UAE, for example, or even now Saudi, or Morocco, are countries who have understood and adjusted to how the global trends are taking shape. Therefore, we need to understand how the global economy is changing. Two, we need to build cooperation for a purpose. In the past, it was more an identity issue that we need to integrate because we have a lot in common. Now you need to create purpose-based cooperation. The purpose-based cooperation is around strategic plays where countries in the region can come together and benefit. Technology is one. Environment, we are talking about some of the key environmental challenges that the region is facing. Take the example of water, for example, something that is shared with more than one country. Take the example of connectivity. Connectivity is very useful for financial flows, is very useful for technological integration and so on. Therefore, we need to work on that. And also, we need to address collectively the challenges. Take the case of refugees or internally displaced. This is one of the most challenging issue for the region. 1/3 of the global challenge in displacement and refugees is in the region. We need to have a policy that takes into consideration how collectively we need to address that, and so on. Therefore, I think we need to shape up a new model whereby cooperation is for a purpose, and also understand how the world is changing, and also make sure that we still, because we are strategic, we are at the crossroad between East and West, North and South. And therefore, we need also to make sure that we are still relevant in this global trend of trade, investment, the new routes, the new corridors that are now being reshaped, especially after the war between Russia and Ukraine, also are important dimensions to take into consideration.
And one last question, and I'm going to ask you perhaps to project a little bit. What is the worst case scenario that you fear, looking at the numbers, and what is the best case scenario in the coming months for the region?
It's a very tough question because, again, it's very difficult when things are moving so deeply and so fast with still very high level of uncertainty to plan. I would say definitely there are certain number of big risks. The first one is an extension or a deepening of the conflict that could create new stigma that would require decades to be addressed. Two, not to understand that this is a tectonic shift, and not to understand that this would require a long-term strategy, not only to address the immediate impact, but also to address and heal some of the long-standing issues. Otherwise, we are solving an immediate problem, but the real problem and the real issue that is affecting the region will stay with us. Three, we need to think the future differently from the way we did in the past. The world is changing, the region is changing, our priorities are changing, our population, our technology is changing also, the way we look at things. We also need to look to the old issues and the new issue with a new lens. We cannot keep repeating the same approaches and then expect to have better outcome. And those are important issues that we have the tendency in the region is to move on very quickly and not to have a long-term transformations. I was encouraged, for example, by what some of the Gulf countries are doing, which is to move into more long-term approaches to economic development. and also to link this to human development, to social and aspirational priorities. I think this is something that we can learn from and expect. There is something that we need to do economically that would require also the international community to come in. It's a global issue and requires global support. At the time where the world is more and more fragmented, there are more polarizations. I think this region can be one of the cases where, despite this polarization, international forces could come together and help in this huge challenge that we're going through. My last hope is we are still a young region with 2/3 of the population below 30. We are still have a lot of potential for our economy, our society to benefit from the great contribution that women could provide, not only socially, but also economically and in terms of leadership. I think those are two priorities that could drive our effort for the next 10, 15 years and could change a bit the paradigm that we are stuck in, or the region is stuck in, over the last 2-3 decades. The region has tried over the last decades, since the Arab uprising in 2011, to move, to change, with a lot of aspirations, a lot of hope, and a lot of disappointment. I think now it's time to be a bit more realistic, but also to maintain this drive for transformation in a positive way and in a more inclusive way.
Thank you. I cannot agree more, and I'm very pleased to hear that the hope lies in both youth and women, particularly given a lot of the work that we have done at the Wilson Center, zooming into the workforce development formula, how it impacts youth, but also trying to understand and unpack the MENA paradox when it comes to women's labor participation, because they're highly educated, but they need to be invested in, and they need to be given greater opportunities. And as you said, when it comes to leadership as well. Mr. Jihad Azour, thank you so much for your expertise and your insights, and we look forward to continuing the discussion in a few months' time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much.